The water jug slipped. Ilara caught it before it hit the floor, but the sound it made against her palm, a sharp, hollow knock, cut through the nearest conversation like a blade through cloth. 3 nobles turned their heads. The one closest to her, a broad-shouldered man with a heavy silver chain draped across his chest, looked directly at her, with an expression she had seen enough times to no longer flinch at. It was not anger. Anger would have required him to register her as a person first. This was something quieter and more complete than anger. The brief, mild awareness of something in the environment that had made an unscheduled noise, assessed and dismissed. She lowered her chin, tightened her grip on the ceramic handle, and moved along the wall without saying a word. The hall of binding was full in a way that pressed against the walls. Every seat at the long stone tables had been occupied since before sunset, and the standing rows along all 4 sides were dense with wolves from packs across the entire kingdom. The annual summit gathered like this only once a year, and the royal household staff had been preparing for it without a full night's rest for 3 weeks straight. Ilara had folded 300 cloth napkins by herself over 2 consecutive evenings. She had polished every serving goblet in the east kitchen twice, once in the afternoon, and again after the other kitchen workers left, because she had caught the faint mineral watermark on the 3rd row of goblets that would become visible under candlelight, and she could not leave it there knowing that. She had repressed the velvet table runners, reorganized the candle display in the outer antechamber, because 3 of the candles had been leaning slightly to the right, in a way that would bother her all evening if she did not fix it, and she had spent 40 minutes the previous morning checking the hem of every formal serving cloth for fraying, because the head steward had mentioned in passing that the Eastern ambassador took particular note of linen quality. She was thorough, not because anyone had asked her to be thorough, and not because thoroughness would be noticed or rewarded. She was thorough because it was the one thing in her daily existence that was entirely her own choice. Her room was assigned to her. Her uniform was assigned. Her schedule, her section of the hall, her permitted words and their permitted volume, and their permitted occasions. All of it was structured and assigned by the people above her, in a hierarchy she occupied the very base of. Thoroughness lived outside all of that. She chose it every single day, with the specific deliberateness of a person who has identified the narrow dimensions of their freedom, and has decided to fill those dimensions completely. She moved between the tables with the water jug held at the approved angle, refilling goblets that had dropped below half, stepping smoothly clear of anyone who shifted or rose, keeping her eyes at the precise downward angle that communicated respectful attention, without suggesting inattention to her task. She made no sound beyond the soft pour of water and the quiet return of the jug to its rest position at her side. She did not speak unless directly addressed. She did not look up unless the situation required it. She followed the rules. She did not agree with the rules. These had been 2 separate things for 3 years. The hall smelled of candle smoke and cedar oil, and the collective warmth of too many wolves in one enclosed space. And beneath all of that, the particular charge in the air that came from a concentration of powerful wolves who were aware of one another's power. She moved through it, and she noticed everything. She had always noticed everything. Head Steward Corvus was positioned near the main entrance, with his hands clasped in front of him. From a distance, this looked appropriately formal. From 3 years of watching Corvus manage difficult evenings, she knew that he only held his hands that way when something in the night's schedule had already gone slightly wrong, and he was in the process of quietly managing it before anyone noticed. His fingers were too tightly interlocked. She noted this and kept moving. Lord Gareth from the Western Ridge occupied his customary seat at the middle of the central table. She counted his wine refill as she passed. This was his 3rd since she had come to this section of the hall, and he had not touched the plate of food that had been set in front of him. People in a state of genuine ease ate without thinking about it. Gareth was not eating, and she had watched him at 3 previous summits. Something tonight was pulling at him. The 2 senior council members near the east window, Elder Rowan and the man everyone simply called Lord Adrian, had stopped their conversation the moment she came within a comfortable radius of their table. They resumed only when she was 3 full steps past them. This was the 4th time tonight this specific thing had happened, with these specific 2 men, and she had noticed the same pattern in different rooms on different occasions over the past several months. It was not a casual coincidence. It was consistent and targeted, and it told her something she did not yet have the full shape of. She carried these observations the way you carry things that have no obvious place to be set down, carefully, for a long time, waiting. The large iron doors at the far end of the hall had been sealed since before the first guests arrived, and this was by deliberate design. The Alpha King's entrance was always staged this way. The room filled and settled. The waiting built its own particular weight. Then the doors opened, and the person walking through them did not need to do anything elaborate to command the space, because the space had been prepared for commanding by the act of waiting. She had watched this sequence at 2 previous summits, and she understood it clearly. Ceremony was power dressed in its formal clothing. She took up her position beside the decorative herb arrangement on the left side of the hall, rosemary and dried lavender and a branch of something dark and aromatic she had never been able to identify. She straightened a stem of lavender that did not need straightening, and she waited. The iron doors opened. Every conversation in the hall stopped at precisely the same moment, not gradually, not tapering off in the way that conversations naturally fade. Stopped, all at once, as if someone had placed a hand over every mouth simultaneously. Bodies rose. Chairs scraped stone. Even Lord Gareth of the Western Ridge set his wine cup down and stood straight. Elara kept her chin at the angle she had calibrated over 3 years, present enough to be appropriate, controlled enough not to invite attention. She watched through the narrow, precise aperture of a gaze that was not a stare. King Caelendrath walked into the Hall of Binding, the way very few people walked into any room over the course of their lives, without visible effort, without self-consciousness about the effect he was producing, which was precisely what produced it. He was not the largest wolf in the room. There were 3 men seated at the nearest table who exceeded him in height and breadth, but nothing in the room reorganized itself around those 3 men. Everything reorganized itself around him. He wore a formal coat in dark charcoal, plain at the cuffs and collar, with his rank markings kept simple and unornamented. This had always struck her as significant, across every observation she had made of him. The wolves who most needed elaborate insignia were typically those whose standing felt precarious enough to require external reinforcement. Caelan wore only what was required. His authority appeared to be entirely internal, or it appeared nowhere. His face was closed, not cold in the brittle way of men who needed others to fear them. Sealed, deliberately and completely sealed, in the way of a person who had, at some point, decided that the cost of being readable was higher than they were willing to pay. She had studied that face from safe distances for 3 years, and had never once felt certain of what lived behind it. He moved through the rows of bowing wolves with a slight downward motion of his chin, to acknowledge each cluster. No words, no extended eye contact, no pause. He reached the head of the central table, stood for 2 seconds, and sat. The room sat with him, as if his sitting were the signal they had all been holding themselves for. The evening that followed lasted 3 hours, and contained, as summit evenings always did, a great deal of carefully structured nothing. Pack reports were delivered with the specific precision of information that has been selected for presentation rather than full disclosure. Alliances were communicated through seating arrangements and the direction of toasts. Elder Mordecai, seated 2 positions to the left of the king, spoke twice. His voice carried the perfectly calibrated warmth of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how much warmth to perform in any given setting. Warm enough to seem genuine, consistent enough to function as a professional instrument rather than a human quality. She had been studying Mordecai since her 3rd month in the household, not because of any single observable act, but because of a pattern. His eyes moved too quickly for a man of his claimed composure, always finding the entrance of a room the moment a door opened, even mid-sentence. His pauses before answering questions were consistently a beat longer than his apparent confidence should have required. Certain junior council members seemed to practice the art of becoming unavailable just before Mordecai appeared in a corridor, as if their absences had been rehearsed. Decisions that were announced as originating with the king had a way of arriving in Mordecai's hands before they were officially confirmed. None of this was evidence of anything she could name. It was a shape. She had been carrying the shape for 3 years. Near the midpoint of the evening, the newest member of the serving staff, a boy named Pip who had been with the household for 6 weeks, and who carried in the set of his thin shoulders the concentrated effort of someone trying very hard not to make a mistake, lost his grip on a full tray of dessert plates at the east corridor entrance. The sound was considerable. Ceramic on stone carried across the quieted mid-dinner hall and made at least 6 wolves flinch. The one nearest the corridor entrance made a sound of sharp displeasure. Elara was already moving before any senior staff member had reacted. She reached the corridor in a dozen steps, crouched beside Pip, and began collecting the larger pieces with calm, quick hands. The boy was shaking. His face had gone the color of the pale stone floor. "Look only at your hands," she said, low enough for just him. "Keep them moving. Do not look into the hall." He was barely breathing. "They will send me away." "They will not," she said. "This has happened before in this hall, and no one was dismissed for it. The senior staff will be irritated for approximately 4 minutes, and then they will have something more pressing to manage. Keep your hands working." She passed him the last significant fragment, stood, and was back at her position along the left wall before the head of serving staff had crossed half the distance to the corridor entrance. She refilled a goblet as she passed. Her expression did not shift. Pip reappeared 2 minutes later, with a clean cloth and a small brush, and swept the corridor quietly. No ranked wolf addressed him. The conversation at the nearest table had already moved on entirely. She watched from her wall position and thought, as she sometimes did in these moments, that there were two faces to being invisible. One was the slow, accumulated weight of not being seen consistently enough that you began to understand it might be permanent. The other was the ability to move through the gaps that power left unsupervised, and do useful things in those gaps that mattered in a small but real way. She had made an uncomfortable peace with both faces. She had not accepted either fully. She was still thinking about Pip and moving along the left wall for the 4th time that hour when she glanced, by habit, toward the head of the central table. The king was looking in her direction. She adjusted her thinking immediately. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her, or at something in the general area of the wall behind her, or through some private calculation that happened to align with her position. Men of his standing did not look at Omega servants. The look did not move. It stayed on her for a second, and then a second more, and then it narrowed, just slightly, in the very specific way that eyes narrow when they have located a particular thing within a general area, rather than continuing to scan across it. She dropped her gaze to the floor tiles. She focused on a small chip in the corner of the nearest tile, something she had noticed months ago and never reported to the maintenance staff. She kept walking at the same pace, and did not look back toward the head of the table for the remainder of the evening. The hall emptied over the final hour. Small groups departed with formal bows. The candles burned to their lower marks. By the time only a small cluster of senior council members remained at one corner of the central table, Ilara's feet had been on cold stone for 4 hours, and her shoulders carried the deep, specific tightness that came from sustained, deliberate stillness. She collected the last of the empty goblets from the tables near the main entrance, stacking them in the crook of her arm with practiced care. She was turning toward the service corridor when the side door, the one connecting to the private administrative passage, opened directly into her path. She stepped back, and the goblets knocked together in her grip, and she steadied herself and looked up. King Kalen Drath was standing less than 2 feet from her. He had come through the private passage without his formal coat, in just his plain uniform, and without the coat and the ceremony of the main entrance. He was different in a way that absorbed her before she had words for it. Not smaller, more specific, more like the actual person, without the constructed formality of a summit evening wrapped around him. She could see, at this distance, the tiredness around his eyes that was simply not visible from across a banquet hall, the kind of tiredness that did not come from a single late night, but from accumulated nights stacked into something that had become structural, something long held and heavy. Protocol said, "Bow, step sideways, eyes down, silence." She was startled, and the gap between knowing a rule and executing it is always widest when the body has just absorbed an unexpected shock, and for one full beat, she simply looked at him. He looked back at her. His eyes were dark brown, and not cold, and not indifferent. They were the eyes of a person who had been carrying something very specific for a very long time without putting it down, and who had stopped, some time ago, expecting anyone to notice. Then her training found her, and she had her chin down and her body sideways in one smooth movement. "Carry on," he said. He walked past her. His footsteps faded down the main corridor. The hall was empty and quiet around her. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then she went to the service kitchen, set the goblets down carefully, wiped the counter, said quiet goodnights to the 2 remaining workers, and walked the long corridor back to the Omega wing. She pressed her hand against her left collarbone as she walked, over the crescent mark. She had done this for so long that she no longer noticed the gesture. It had become automatic, a habit of 3 years or longer. Her mother had always told her it was nothing, just a pigment difference. Just a quirk of birth that was better kept covered because people asked questions about it that did not have satisfying answers. Walking through the dim corridor with her palm pressed against it, she noticed for the first time that the mark felt warm under her fingers. Not the warmth of a working body at the end of a long evening. Something else. Something she chose not to examine too closely. Because examining things too closely before you had the language for them could make them more frightening than they needed to be. She went to bed. She did not sleep easily. 3 nights before the coronation was when the silence in this household finally broke open. Elara had not been sleeping well since the summit dinner. This was not entirely new. She was not a naturally easy sleeper, and the weeks surrounding any major royal event compressed the workload on domestic staff to a degree that left everyone wound too tightly in the hours they were supposed to be resting. But the insomnia of those 3 nights had a specific texture that was different from ordinary tiredness. It was the wakefulness that comes when the mind cannot stop working on something it cannot yet name, the way a word you cannot recall keeps surfacing at the edge of thought without arriving. She lay on her narrow bed in the Omega quarters, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about what she knew, and what she did not know, and what the space between the two might be concealing. She got up past midnight. She pulled her uniform on over her sleeping clothes, more for warmth than any sense of propriety at that hour, and walked to the small kitchen at the end of the Omega wing for a glass of water. The kitchen was cold and quiet. She stood at the narrow window with the glass and looked at the courtyard below, where a night guard named Owen was completing his steady circuit of the east perimeter. She had noticed Owen before. He was one of the few junior guards in the household who appeared to actually pay attention during his rounds, rather than simply completing them on schedule. His pace was even. His eyes moved. He took the work seriously. She rinsed the glass, set it on the drying board, and turned back toward the corridor. She took a wrong turn. This should not have been possible. She knew the East Wing corridors the way she knew her own handwriting, the angles, the distances, the particular quality of light at each junction. But the lamps in the lower East corridor had been dimmed significantly beyond their usual setting that night. A new member of the maintenance staff had misread the schedule and reduced the lighting in the wrong section. The junction at the end of the servants' passage looked different in near darkness than it did at half lamp, and she turned left where the correct direction was right. 2 steps told her. The floor changed under her feet, from the smooth, worn stone of the servants' passage to the heavier, more formal flagstone of the private administrative corridor. She stopped. This was not her territory. Omega domestic staff had no sanctioned reason to be in the private administrative wing, and particularly not at this hour. The correct course was immediate reversal. She had already turned back when she heard the voices. They came through the iron-banded door of the council preparation room, 30 feet ahead and to the right. She recognized the room by memory. She had delivered refreshments there 3 times on official assignments, and she knew the acoustic quality of words coming through that specific old door. The voices were low, deliberately, precisely low, the exact register of people who had chosen their volume with the conscious intention of not being heard outside the room. She stood with her back already turned in the direction of safety, and she did not move. She knew the intelligent choice. She knew the safe choice. They were the same choice, and she knew it with complete clarity, and she stayed. She turned back. She moved toward the door. Not all the way. Not close enough to be seen if it opened. She stopped 10 feet back, in the shadow between 2 wall lamps that had been left unlit that night, and she stood as still as she had ever stood in her life, and she directed every particle of her attention toward the gap at the base of the iron-banded door. The first voice she caught clearly was Mordecai's. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a sound that has long history with you. But this voice was stripped of everything she had heard in it before. The measured warmth, the calibrated performance of ease, the professional smoothness. None of it was present. What remained underneath was cool and hard and precise, the way a key is cool and hard and precise. It was a voice designed for a room where no one was watching. The transfer paperwork has already been prepared, Mordecai said. It will go through the standard channels. A domestic reassignment in the week of a major ceremony attracts no attention. There is always movement on the staff in these periods. The second voice was a man she did not recognize, lower in register, speaking quietly enough that she caught only the shape of what he said. A question, an upward inflection at its end. Mordecai answered, and his voice dropped further. She leaned every part of herself toward the door without moving her feet. She has been in this household for 3 years, and she does not know what she is. This is our significant advantage. If she had known when she first arrived, we would have had a different problem entirely. She believes the mark is cosmetic. People believe what they have been taught to believe about themselves from the beginning. Her mother taught her correctly. Her mother. Something arrived in her chest before comprehension arrived in her mind. A cold drop that spread outward from its landing point and kept spreading. She pressed her left hand flat against the stone wall beside her and held it there. The mark on the Omega girl must not be seen before the coronation ceremony. Mordecai's voice came through the door with unusual clarity on this sentence, as if he had shifted slightly toward it. Then it dropped again, and she strained to close the remaining distance between herself and what he was saying. Once the ceremony is completed under the revised protocol and the binding is sealed, the bloodline question becomes legally moot. The window of risk closes the moment the new rite is complete. The bloodline question, the mark, the window of risk. She was standing in a cold corridor in the middle of the night, and her palm was against a stone wall, and every sentence she had just heard was rearranging itself inside her, in a way that had nothing to do with any framework she had brought to this building 3 years ago. The second voice asked something she caught only partially. Then Mordecai answered, and within the answer she caught pieces, the word record, the word suppression, and a phrase that she could not fully assemble before it dropped below her hearing. Then, at the end of an exchange she received only in fragments, Mordecai said one word with complete clarity. He said Seraphina. Not with grief, not with the softened register of someone speaking the name of a person they had mourned. He said it the way you say the name of a number in a calculation, a known value in a fixed equation, already solved for, already filed. The king's first mate, dead for 2 years and 8 months. Never spoken of in this household across 3 years of Alara's presence in it, not in the soft-edged way of people who protect a grief that still belongs to them, but in the specific, maintained silence of people who have agreed not to speak of something for reasons that have nothing to do with grief. Said now, in a private room in the middle of the night, in a conversation about an Omega servant's birthmark, and a coronation ceremony 5 days away. She turned, and she walked back down the corridor, with the specific controlled pace of someone who cannot afford the sound of running, but is holding their body to that pace by will alone. She reached the junction. She found the correct turn. She moved through the Omega wing past the rows of sleeping beds with the careful tread of someone who could not wake anyone, and knew every floorboard, and chose her steps accordingly. She reached the small corner room at the far end of the wing, and she knocked. Once, so lightly it was almost not a sound. The door opened 20 seconds later. Lyra stood in the frame with her hair unbraided and her eyes soft at the edges from interrupted sleep. She looked at Alara's face, and the softness left her eyes entirely in a single moment, replaced by a sharp, complete attention that required no words to establish itself. "Come in," she said. Alara sat on the edge of Lyra's bed, because her legs had been steady throughout the corridor, and had apparently decided that safety was the appropriate moment to register what they had been holding back. She held her own hands in her lap and looked at them, and thought about the order in which to say things, and then decided order was not what mattered here. She told Lyra everything, from the wrong turn in the dim corridor to the voices through the iron-banded door, to the last thing she had heard before she walked away. She said it plainly, at a pace slightly faster than her normal telling, without stopping once. Lyra listened with her hands in her lap, and her face still, and her eyes entirely on Alara. She did not speak. She did not manage her expression into visible reactions. She simply received every word in the way that was most valuable and rarest, not to the space between sentences where she could fit her own response, but to the actual content of what was being said. When Alara finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Lyra stood. She moved to the low wooden chest beneath her sleeping board, and crouched in front of it, and opened it with careful hands. She moved the folded garments aside. From the very bottom of the chest, she lifted a small square of paper, old paper, the kind that had been kept clean and protected, but for long enough that age had softened its edges. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and Alara recognized in her face the expression of someone who has been preparing for a necessary thing, and has now discovered that preparation and the thing itself are not the same. "Your mother gave this to me," Lyra said. She did not move toward Alara yet. She looked at the paper in her own hands. "She gave it to me the night before she died. She made me promise not to give it to you until the moment it was truly necessary." A pause. "She told me I would know when that moment had arrived." She crossed the room and placed the paper in Alara's hands. She was right. Alara held it for a moment. Then she unfolded it carefully. Her mother's handwriting. The familiar lean of the letters. The way the pen had pressed harder on the words that carried more weight. The unconscious mid-stroke corrections without lifting the pen. All of it arrived before the words themselves did, as recognition of a voice rather than a text. It reached somewhere below the level of thought first, and somewhere else second. She read it through once, quickly. Then she sat with it for a moment. Then she read it again slowly. She looked up at Lyra. "What is a keeper bloodline?" she said. Lyra sat beside her on the narrow bed, and folded her hands in her lap, and began from the beginning. The beginning, as Lyra had been told it by Alara's mother on a night 4 years ago, was a very long time before any of them had been born. Centuries before the current council structure, before the organized hierarchy of rank that governed every wolf's life from the moment of designation to the moment of death. Before all of that, there had been a different arrangement. Not a better one necessarily, as the account Alara's mother had given Lyra was careful not to make evaluative judgments. Just a different one. A system in which the Omega designation was not the base of a hierarchy, but a specific function within a larger structure that the current hierarchy had systematically erased from the record. Keeper bloodlines were the thing that had been erased. The Keeper designation had not existed officially for approximately 140 years, not because it had naturally ended, because it had been made to end. A High Council decision, sealed under the classification code used for matters considered too sensitive for public record, had outlawed the Keeper's ceremonial role and ordered the destruction of every bloodline document that could be found and confiscated. The order had been carried out thoroughly, but not completely, because orders of that kind are never carried out completely. Some families hid their children's records before the council's representatives arrived. Some passed the knowledge forward in the interior way of things that cannot be officially preserved, spoken from one person to the next, held in memory rather than paper, trusted forward through generations. Alara's mother had come from one of those families, and Alara was her daughter. The function of a keeper was specific and, to anyone who understood it, immediately understandable as a thing that powerful men would want eliminated. A keeper Omega, brought into the presence of the Alpha King she was bloodline designated for, not a king of her choosing, but the one determined by the ancient matching record, could not lie to him. This was the first part of it. The second part was what made it dangerous to every person who had ever wanted to control a king, without the king knowing he was being controlled. In a keeper's presence, the king could not lie to her either. Not in the sense that lying became difficult or guilt-inducing, in the sense that truth operated between them outside either person's voluntary control. A false statement could not hold its form in the air between them. The truth simply arrived, whether or not anyone wanted it to. The bond activated fully, only through the ancient coronation rite, an Omega keeper, approaching the king during the ceremony and speaking directly to him, in the traditional form, in the presence of the court. This was why the keeper ceremony had been outlawed. Not because it threatened the kingdom, because it threatened everyone who had learned to make decisions for the kingdom without the king's full awareness. Because a king who could not be misled by his Omega keeper was a king whose advisors had significantly less power over than they had become accustomed to. The crescent mark on the left collarbone was the physical marker of the bloodline. It appeared on every female keeper in every recorded generation of the lineage. It was specific enough that someone who knew the record would recognize it with certainty. Mordecai knew the record. He had known what Alara was from the moment he first encountered her mark. He had spent 3 years managing her ignorance with the patience of a man who understood that ignorance, properly maintained, was considerably less complicated than other solutions. He had counted on the fact that her mother had taught her to call the mark nothing, and that Alara had been taught to call it nothing, and that 3 years of being invisible in a household had given her no occasion to discover otherwise. He had miscalculated one thing, the wrong turn in a dim corridor. Alara sat with all of this for a long time after Lyra finished speaking. She held her mother's note in her hands and looked at the opposite wall of the small room and let the information find its places inside her. It did not arrive neatly. It arrived the way large things arrive when they come in at once, overlapping, flooding the space, requiring more than one pass to sort. She thought about the transfer order that had already been prepared, waiting for its scheduled moment. She thought about what Mordecai had called the window of risk, and the fact that the window he was referring to was the span of days between now and the coronation, and that the woman who constituted the risk in his calculation was her. She thought about the phrase, "the bloodline question becomes legally moot," about what it meant that there was a version of the coronation ceremony under which her bloodline became irrelevant, and what it meant that Mordecai had prepared that version without the king's knowledge. She thought about Seraphina's name in the dark, said the way you say a solved variable. She pressed her palm against the crescent mark and held it there. "Ilara," Lyra said, very carefully. "I am not going to leave," Ilara said. She said it before Lyra had finished forming the question, because she had heard the shape of the question coming. She was not going to leave. She had known this since the moment she walked back through the Omega wing from the corridor, since before she knocked on Lyra's door. It was already decided in some part of her that did not take votes. Lyra was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "The coronation is in 5 days. If the transfer takes effect before that, none of this matters. Not the bloodline, not the mark, not the bond. The window closes. Whatever Mordecai has built will be sealed under whatever revised protocol he has prepared, and the ceiling will drop permanently." She said this plainly, the way she told herself difficult truths, not in fear, but in the flat, direct manner of a person who finds it easier to look at hard things when they are stated without decoration. 5 days. I need to be in the same room as the king before the ceremony, not after, before. "The transfer will arrive before 5 days are up," Lyra said. "Yes. And you have no sanctioned access to him." "No." Lyra looked at her in the quiet way of someone who has already understood where this is going, and is giving the person in front of her the respect of arriving there on their own schedule. Ilara looked at her mother's handwriting, the specific, familiar pressure on the words that had weighed more. A hand that had held this secret for 30 years, and passed it on at the last possible moment, because it had become impossible to hold longer. "By tomorrow morning, I will have the beginning of a plan," she said. She folded the note carefully, and handed it back to Lyra. "Keep this somewhere more secure than the chest." Lyra took it without speaking, and they sat in the small room for a little longer, and then Ilara went back to her bed, and for the first time in 3 nights, she slept. Kaelin had not been sleeping either. He could have predicted this without much difficulty. Sleep had been inconsistent since Seraphina died, and in the 2 weeks before any major formal event, it became essentially theoretical, something he knew still existed in the world, but experienced only in short, unconvincing intervals between the hours his mind insisted on using for other purposes. Tonight he sat at the desk in his private study, which was where he ended up at 2 in the morning, when sleep declined to present itself. The desk was covered in the usual accumulation of the days before a major ceremony. Logistics, council briefings, the formal schedule broken into 15-minute intervals, the draft of the address he was expected to deliver at the coronation opening. He had read the draft 3 times without writing a single note on it. The address was correct. It contained all the required elements. It would read exactly as it was supposed to read. He had been producing text that read exactly as it was supposed to read for a very long time. He had become skilled at it. Some nights he was not sure whether this was a quality he had developed, or simply something that had happened to him gradually, the way small erosions accumulate into a changed shape before you have noticed the change occurring. He set the draft aside and looked at the wall. Seraphina had been dead for 2 years and 8 months. The specific count of months was a number he did not try to know and always knew anyway, the way certain numbers attach themselves to you when they carry enough weight. He had loved her with the kind of love that does not announce itself frequently, but is simply always there when tested, steady, quiet, present, in all the ways that the ordinary days of a life require. She had been patient with him, in ways he had not recognized as patience until she was gone, and the recognition arrived too late to serve any useful purpose. The official account was illness, a rapid deterioration over 3 weeks, unresponsive to the treatments the household physician administered, concluding on a night in late autumn, when Kaelin had been in the Eastern Hall at a mandatory council session that Elder Mordecai had stated with complete firmness could not be rescheduled. He had never said this out loud to anyone. He said it to himself, in rooms like this one at hours like this one, with enough frequency that it had gradually stopped feeling like an accusation and had become simply a fact that lived in him alongside the grief. On the night Serafina died, Mordecai had arranged for him to be somewhere else. He had never been able to say why he was certain of this, because certainty in the absence of evidence is not a useful instrument. He carried it anyway. He had been stalling the coronation ceremony for 4 months. His advisors attributed this to grief, and grief was partially true, which made it a workable explanation. But the other part had nothing to do with grief. The other part was that he had been studying the ancient coronation rites in private, cross-referencing the protocol Mordecai had presented as standard against every historical source he could access, without going through the council library, which Mordecai supervised. The discrepancies he had found were small. Specifically, surgically small, designed to be unnoticeable to anyone who was not already looking for them with a specific question in mind. He was looking for them with a specific question in mind. He had been a king long enough to understand something that required many years of practice to internalize. The question was never whether something was wrong. The question was always what kind of wrong it was, and what it would cost to correct, and whether the moment for correction had arrived or needed to be held until the necessary conditions were in place. He stood and went to the window. The courtyard below was mostly dark. Owen, the careful junior guard assigned to the east perimeter, was completing his circuit with steady regularity. Kalen watched him make the far turn, and thought briefly about the specific quality of steadiness in people who had no political reason to perform it. Owen was steady because he took the work seriously, not because anyone important was watching. This was a rarer quality than it should have been. He turned from the window. He thought, as he had done without permission or planning for 3 nights, about the Omega servant he had nearly walked into in the side corridor after the summit dinner. Not with any analyzable intent, simply that the image returned to him at intervals, the way images sometimes do when something is registered with significance, before the conscious mind has caught up to what the significance was. She had looked directly at him. For one unguarded beat, she had held eye contact with him in a way that no Omega servant in his household had ever done in 3 years, without the automatic, practiced downward adjustment that every person in her position deployed whenever a ranked wolf was within range. And then she had adjusted correctly and efficiently, and he had walked past, and said carry on, as if the single beat of direct contact had not existed. But something in him had taken note of it. Not desire. He knew what that felt like, and it was not that. Not simply curiosity. Something quieter, and more difficult to name. The recognition of someone who was entirely present inside their own life, despite every structural pressure to be less present than that. A glimpse of a person behind an expression that was trained to conceal one. He had been carrying this for 3 nights without understanding why it stayed. His wolf had been quiet for 2 years and 8 months. Since Serafina. The kind of quiet that is not peace, but the specific stillness of something that has stopped expecting things, and has organized itself around the absence of expectation. He had accepted this as what was left. He had not expected anything to disturb it. And then the still place in him had moved. Briefly, inexplicably, when he looked into the hall and found those amber eyes along the left wall. Not a wave or a surge of anything dramatic. Something smaller than that. A shift. The particular sensation of something coming back to life in a small way. Not because it had been told to, but because something in the environment had reached it without asking permission. He had not spoken of this to anyone. He had no language for it that made sense in the context of his life as it was currently configured. He went back to the desk. He looked at the draft address. He did not work on it. He went to bed at an hour that was already beginning to lighten at its edges, and he lay in the dark and he thought, as he sometimes thought without being able to stop it, about the 2 years and 8 months of answers he did not yet have, and the coronation that was 5 days away, and the specific discrepancies in the revised protocol that Mordecai had presented as standard. He slept for 3 hours. He woke before the call bell, and sat at the edge of the bed, and looked at the wall, and thought about what he was waiting for, and why he kept waiting, and whether the moment he had been waiting for had already arrived, in a form he had not recognized. The transfer order arrived at 8 in the morning, on the 3rd day before the summit concluded. Elara had spent the 2 days after her conversation with Lyra, working her assigned shifts with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to them, and thinking without stopping. She thought the way she thought through difficult things, not in circles, not in spirals, but in the flat, methodical manner of someone taking a careful inventory. These are the facts. These are the constraints. These are the possible courses of action. These are the consequences of each. She had done this many times in her life, for much smaller problems, and the practice made the larger one manageable in a way it would not otherwise have been. She was an Omega servant with no official standing, no sanctioned access to the king, and no mechanism for raising a credible concern against a senior elder through any formal channel that Mordecai did not already have influence over. The constraints were equally clear. She had a diminishing number of days before the coronation, and within that window she would receive a transfer order designed to remove her from the household before the ceremony could take place. The only thing that mattered in the next 5 days was getting into the same space as the king before the transfer took effect. She had thought through every formal and semi-formal occasion on the schedule. Summit sessions. She was assigned to corridor duty, not the session rooms. The closing council meal, a senior staff event she had no role in. The evening reception at the conclusion of the summit. She was assigned to the outer hall, not the inner one. The morning walkthrough of the new wing construction, not a domestic staff function. She set all of these aside. Then she thought about what she actually knew about Kaelin Drath that was not on any official schedule. She had been watching this household for 3 years. Not only the formal calendar but the informal patterns. The personal rhythms that people develop in the spaces their structured lives leave open. The things that happen consistently, not because they are required, but because humans are creatures of habit, and habit is what fills the gaps between obligation. Every Tuesday morning, between the conclusion of the dawn meal and the beginning of the first formal council session, King Kaelin Drath walked in the East Garden. She had noticed this first approximately 18 months ago. She had confirmed it over the months following, not by positioning herself to observe him directly, which would have been both impossible and dangerous, but by paying attention to the pattern of the head groundskeeper's schedule. The groundskeeper worked certain sections of the garden on specific days of the week, and she had noticed that certain sections were consistently left untouched on Tuesday mornings. She had eventually understood why. The garden walk was the king's private time. No council in attendance. No guards posted inside the garden walls, only at the outer perimeter. An hour, sometimes slightly longer, in the gap between the formal structures of his days. She had never seen him use it, because she had never had reason to be near it on a Tuesday morning, but she had known about it for over a year. Tomorrow was Tuesday. The transfer order arrived at 8 in the morning, presented to her formally by head steward Corvus, who held the sealed document with the careful expression of a man executing a task he had not chosen, and was attempting to perform with professional dignity. She took it from him. She read it without allowing her expression to shift. Northern Outpost. 3 days until effective date. The morning 3 days before the coronation. She thanked Corvus and returned to her work. At 4 in the afternoon she found Lyra in the laundry room and told her quietly. Lyra received this with the stillness of someone who had been expecting it. They agreed on a set of practical arrangements. What to do if things went wrong in the garden in the morning. How to protect the paper from the chest. What Lyra's options were in the remaining days depending on what happened. It was a short conversation. They had already covered the larger territory. That evening, Alara pressed her uniform with particular care. She oiled her shoes. She braided her hair in the style she wore for formal household days. Because even in a garden at dawn, there was no version of this encounter where appearing careless was going to help her. She went to bed at the right time. She slept with the specific efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is now conserving themselves for what the decision requires. The East Garden was at its quietest and most still at dawn. The morning light came in from the eastern wall in long horizontal lines and caught the moisture on the stone paths and the herb borders in a way that made everything look cleaned and precise. It was a physical beauty that she had noted many times in passing on other mornings, and had never previously had the occasion to stand still inside. She had come early enough that when the groundskeeper's assistant came to water the far section, she was already working at the rosemary border with her small basket, and her presence read as entirely unremarkable. A domestic servant with a legitimate garden task, who had arrived at her usual time. She had spent 20 minutes building this picture, so that if anyone looked, there was a picture to see. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet, consistent tread of someone who walked softly by long habit rather than conscious effort, which was different from the deliberate quiet of someone trained to patrol. She recognized it from the corridor after the summit dinner. She kept her hands in the rosemary and did not look up yet. He came around the stone path, and he almost walked past her. Then he stopped. She looked up. He was wearing plain clothes, what he wore in his private time, which was considerably simpler than his formal dress, and somehow, in the gray morning light of the garden, more difficult to look at directly. Not more imposing, more real. He looked at her with a slight narrowing of his eyes, the expression of someone encountering something unexpected and calibrating to it quickly. She stood, because remaining seated while a king stood over you was not going to begin this conversation on any useful footing. She kept her hands at her sides, the small basket over one arm. "You are the servant from the corridor," he said, not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She had the sense, this close to him in the quiet garden, that this hour was genuinely private to him, not a performance of privacy but the real thing, the one daily space that belonged entirely to himself, and that her presence here was a disruption of it, that he was in the process of deciding what to do with. "This is my private time," he said. "I know, Your Majesty. I apologize for intruding on it. I would not have come here if I had any other means of reaching you, and I would not have come at all if the matter were not genuinely important." A pause. A bird, somewhere in the outer grounds, was beginning its early routine. The light coming in from the east wall was growing more certain. "What is your name?" "Ilara Voss, Omega Domestic, Third Wing Assignment." He nodded once, not dismissal, acknowledgement, and looked at her in the way of someone assessing whether the time they are considering spending on something is going to be worth it. She was aware that she had approximately 30 seconds before that assessment concluded, in a direction she could not recover from. "I received a transfer order this morning," she said, "processed by Elder Mordecai, effective 3 days before your coronation." She watched his face with the practiced attention of 3 years of observation. His expression did not change visibly, but something in the air behind it did. A small, precise internal adjustment. She kept talking. "I believe the transfer was issued specifically to ensure that I am not present in this household for the coronation ceremony." His eyes were steady. "Why would your presence at the ceremony be of concern to anyone?" She took one breath. "Because of something I am, that I was not told about until 3 nights ago." The garden was completely still around them. "I am not asking you to believe me," she said. "I am not asking for anything that requires trust before it has been earned. I am asking for 5 minutes at the ceremony, 5 minutes to approach you during the ancient rite, in the traditional form, not the revised form that will be presented to you as standard protocol, the original form, the one that the law never formally abolished because the law never formally acknowledged it was being taken away." She held his gaze, because looking away at this moment would unmake everything she had just said. 5 minutes. If nothing comes of it, I will report to my transfer assignment the following morning, without further interference of any kind. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the garden entrance, and was gone around the corner of the stone path, before she had taken another breath. She stood in the morning light, with the basket in her arm, and the rosemary behind her. He had not said yes. He had not said no. He had not said anything at all. She picked a small sprig of rosemary she did not need, and placed it in the basket and went back inside. She told herself that silence was not the same as refusal, and she believed this with approximately 70% conviction, and she went to work and kept it there. The morning of the coronation arrived with a particular stillness that she had not expected. She had anticipated tension, the tight wound kind that came before things you had prepared for but could not fully control. Instead, what she felt when she opened her eyes in the gray before the call bell was something quieter than that. Not calm exactly. The state that comes after a person has committed to something fully enough that the part of the mind responsible for second-guessing has finally stopped raising its hand. She dressed with precision, uniform pressed, hair arranged in the formal style. Shoes oiled 2 nights ago. She looked at herself briefly in the small mirror above the wash basin, and noted that she looked entirely unremarkable, which was exactly what she needed and also, in a different year, exactly what she had always tried to be. She went to work. Her section had been formally reassigned in the transfer documentation, which meant she had no officially designated post in the household on this morning. She was, technically, between assignments, present in the household until tomorrow, when the transfer became effective, but not assigned to any specific ceremonial role today. This was a gray area she had identified 2 days ago and had planned to occupy. She went to the outer preparation area of the ceremonial hall, where the domestic staff assigned to the coronation day had been working since 4 in the morning on the final dressing of the space. She took a position and helped with the remaining tasks without drawing attention to herself, because there were always remaining tasks in the last hours before a major ceremony, and a capable pair of hands moving efficiently through a preparation room is not generally the first thing any senior staff member looks at when there is a great deal to manage. She worked through the morning, and she watched the household around her, and she did not let herself look at the clock too frequently. At the appointed hour, the ceremonial preparations moved into their final phase. The household staff assigned to the inner ceremonial hall took their places. The staff assigned to the outer hall positioned themselves along the wall. Elara moved with the outer hall group, which placed her along the wall nearest the inner hall door, inside the ceremonial space but in the outer ring, separated from the inner circle by 15 feet, and a clear demarcation of standing and designation. The inner hall door was closed. She stood with the correct angle of her chin and the correct placement of her hands, and she looked at the closed door, and she breathed. Further along the wall, Owen took his position. She was aware of him the way you become aware of a specific detail in a room when it carries significance, not conspicuously, not in any way that drew attention to either of them, but present at the edge of her awareness, like a word you are waiting to hear in a sentence. She had seen Owen briefly that morning in the corridor outside the preparation room. Their eyes had met for a moment, just a moment, no longer than the moment in the garden when she had looked at the king, and then he had continued on his route. She had not interpreted this. She had not allowed herself to interpret it, because interpretation in the absence of information was a luxury she could not afford this morning. The ceremony began on the other side of the door. She heard the deep resonance of the formal elder address, the structured responses from the assembled court, the specific quality of silence that preceded each phase of the ancient rite. The sounds came to her, muffled and distant, as though they belonged to a world slightly removed from the one she was standing in. She stood, and she breathed, and she waited. The minutes moved in the way minutes move when you are waiting for something that may or may not come, both slowly and very quickly, at the same time, in a way that is specific to this kind of waiting. Then Owen moved. She caught it in the edge of her vision, a small shift away from the wall, a turn toward the inner hall door. She did not move yet. She waited. He reached the door. He placed his hand on the iron handle. He pressed it down and pulled. The door opened. Owen stepped back and held it and looked at the opposite wall of the outer hall with the focused attention of a guard performing his posted function, and he did not look at her at all. Elara moved. She crossed the outer hall in the kind of walk that is not quite ordinary walking, purposeful enough to read as directed, unhurried enough not to read as running, covering the distance in the time it took for 3 people near the door to register that something was happening and begin to form a response to it. She stepped through the doorway. She was inside. The inner ceremonial hall held the particular stillness of old stone that had absorbed many significant moments and had learned to hold them without showing their weight. The candles were burning at their full height. The smell of cedar oil and formal ceremony and ancient washed stone settled over everything. The assembled court filled the space in their ranked positions, eyes forward, attending to the dais at the far end, where Elder Mordecai stood with the ceremonial document in both hands and the recitation already in progress. King Kalen stood on the dais, facing Mordecai in ceremonial armor that was dark and plain, and exactly the kind of thing he would have chosen for the most formal moment of his life. He looked as he had always looked from a distance, sealed, contained, entirely in control of every surface of himself. No one in the room noticed Elara enter. And then someone did. She heard the change before she saw it, the slight shift in the quality of the room's collective attention, the way a crowd's awareness moves when something has entered the expected sequence that does not belong to the expected sequence. Someone near the doorway had looked, then someone further in, then a ripple moving outward from the entry, person by person, as each one caught the direction of the person next to them and turned to see what they were seeing. She did not stop. She walked the length of the inner ceremonial hall in the most deliberate walk of her life. The ranked wolves did not part for her. They did not move aside in any organized or intentional way. She moved through the space between them, and they stepped back, the way people step back from anything moving toward a clear destination, with enough certainty that their cooperation appears optional. The hall was going quiet, not all at once, as it had gone quiet for the king's entrance at the summit dinner. In pieces, conversation by conversation, each one stopping as the person holding it registered the gray-uniformed Omega servant walking across the inner ceremonial floor, in the direction of the dais. Mordecai saw her. She caught the exact moment. He was looking from the ceremonial document toward the room in the standard elder practice, at the end of a formal paragraph, and his eyes found her at approximately 20 feet from the dais. Every visible element of his composed expression stayed in place. His hands did not tighten on the document. His posture did not shift. But something behind his eyes changed, and she saw it, because she had been studying that face for 3 years, and she knew what ordinary looked like on it. She did not stop. She reached the dais. Kaelin had turned. He was watching her approach with an expression she could not read from any angle she had previously observed him at, because this was a new angle entirely, close and direct, and in full ceremonial context, without any of the managed distance of a corridor or a summit hall. He was looking at her with something she had no exact name for, something that was not surprise, and was not anger, and was not the assertion of authority, something more careful than any of those, something that told her, in the 3 seconds before she stepped forward, that he had known she might come. She stopped at the foot of the dais. The hall was entirely, completely still. She looked at him for a moment, because the moment required it. Then she stepped forward, and she leaned upward. He was considerably taller than her, and the distance required deliberate effort, and she spoke directly and quietly into his ear. She told him what she had overheard in the private administrative corridor 3 nights ago. She told him what Lyra had explained to her from her mother's note, and what the note itself contained. She told him about the Keeper bloodline and the crescent mark on her collarbone, and what the bond between a Keeper and her designated king was capable of doing. And she told him that the bond was active now, in this room, in this moment, and that she could feel it as a warmth in her chest that she had no other name for. She told him what Mordecai had said about the revised protocol, and the window of risk, and the transfer order that had already been prepared. She told him the name Seraphina. And then, because the bond was fully awake between them now, and because the bond's only function was truth, and truth carries its own momentum, something came out of her that she had not planned to say. A truth her bloodline carried, a specific fact from the night Seraphina had died, carried not as a memory, but as knowledge stored in the blood, the kind of knowledge that waits in the Keeper line for the moment it is needed, and then arrives without asking whether the person is ready. She did not understand, in the moment of speaking, how she knew it. She said it because it was true, and because in this space, in this bond, there was no other option. She pulled back. She looked at him. Kaelin Drath's face had gone pale. Not the gray of cold or the white of shock at something alarming. The specific and unmistakable pallor of a man who has just received the answer to the question that has been slowly and steadily destroying him from the inside for 2 years and 8 months, received it whole, without warning, in the middle of a formal ceremony in front of every ranking wolf in his kingdom, and who is now holding that answer with both hands and searching for the next breath. Every wolf in the inner ceremonial hall was completely, breathlessly still. The first thing Kaelin did was breathe. It was visible enough that the council members nearest the dais registered it, that specific and deliberate act of a person pulling themselves back from the interior of a very large thing and returning to the room around them. He breathed in, steady and controlled, and held it for a moment, and let it out, and turned. Not to Alara, not to the formal elder standing to his right. He turned to face Elder Mordecai, who was standing 4 feet away, with the ceremonial document still in both hands, and the particular stillness of a man who has spent years preventing a specific thing from happening, and has just watched it happen anyway. Kaelin looked at him, not for a long time, a few seconds. "Take him into custody," he said. Not loud, not hard-edged. 2 words in the register of complete and irrevocable certainty, the kind that does not require volume, because its weight does the work that volume would otherwise do. The words settled over the room like something that could not be recalled. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then Mordecai spoke. His voice was entirely controlled, which was in itself a revelation. That even at this, even here, With no remaining position to manage from, his first instinct was still to manage. He said that the ceremony had been disrupted by an unauthorized servant who had entered the inner hall without sanction and should be removed immediately. He said the word protocol several times. He said the word procedure. His tone carried the specific confidence of a man who has built his entire career on being the most composed person in any room, under any pressure, and who is now discovering that composure, in this particular moment, is not a sufficient instrument. Several wolves in the inner circle shifted. Not toward Mordecai. The small, careful movement of people who are assessing a changed situation and determining where the ground has settled. 2 wolves in the personal household guard, men who had been in the king's direct service for years, moved from their positions on the dais perimeter. What followed was not clean. Mordecai stepped back. His voice shifted from managed to something harder and cooler than she had imagined from behind the public warmth she had studied, a register she had never heard him use, because it was the register of a man who has stopped performing and is now simply being what he actually is. He cited a specific High Council decree. He cited the classification code under which the Keeper bloodline suppression had been processed. He spoke the names of 2 other senior council members in a way that was not accusation, but that functioned as accusation nonetheless. 2 of those council members, positioned near the central floor, began moving toward the outer edge of the room, with the particular restrained urgency of people in a political environment, doing the rapid calculation of where the solid ground is, and whether they can reach it, before anyone notices they are looking for it. The 2 household guards reached Mordecai. There was a moment, brief and charged and complete, in which everything paused in the way that physical confrontation sometimes pauses just before it resolves, like a breath held at the top. Then Mordecai came with the guards, still upright, still composed in the exterior way of a man whose composure is now entirely willful rather than natural, which made it visible as a performance in a way it had never been visible before. They left through the side exit. The inner ceremonial hall was left standing in the held breath it had been holding for the past several minutes, and then people began to breathe, and the sound of breathing turned into the sound of voices, and voices turned into the specific structured noise of a formal event, reasserting its sense of order. Kalen stood on the dais. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the space where Mordecai had been, and then at the floor, and then he straightened. The sealed quality returned to his face, the same door she had always observed from a distance, but it looked different now, as if the room behind the door was not what it had been before she spoke in his ear. He looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment, then she dropped her chin in the appropriate acknowledgement and stepped back from the dais. A court official moved to intercept her, not with force, with the purposeful manner of someone managing a situation that required management, and she went with him, without needing to be told, because this was not the moment to require direction from anyone. She was taken through the outer hall, through a connecting passage, and into a small antechamber used for council waiting. The official left with the information that someone would be with her shortly. The door closed. She was alone in a quiet room with stone walls and a narrow bench along one side, and the sounds of the inner hall, now resuming in the muffled form that reached her through stone, somewhere on the other side of the corridor. She sat on the bench. She had held herself with complete precision and control since the moment she rose that morning, through every step of what the day had required, and now the task was complete, and she was alone behind a closed door, and her body appeared to have arrived at the conclusion that holding was no longer necessary. Her hands shook, only slightly, and only for a few minutes. She noted it with the same impartial attention she applied to everything, and allowed it without trying to manage it. She had been running on something that was not quite fear, and not quite courage for 5 days, and her hands had apparently been keeping track. The door opened while the shaking was still finishing. It was Lyra, who had apparently decided not to wait to be told where Alara was, and had applied her usual method of finding things, asking the person most likely to know, and working outward from the answer. She came through the door and sat on the bench beside Alara, without saying anything, and put her hand over Alara's hands, and they sat like that in the quiet. The sounds from the inner hall moved through their phases. She could not make out words. She could hear the cadence of authority and response, the deep structured rhythm of a ceremony, resuming after something unprecedented had been inserted into it, the long formal breathing of a ritual trying to find its footing again. It found it. She could tell when it did. The cadence shifted, became more regular, more purposeful, more like the sound of something proceeding rather than recovering. They sat and they waited. Approximately an hour after she had been brought to the antechamber, the door opened a second time. Not a messenger, not an official sent to manage her. King Kalen Drath stood in the doorway, still in his ceremonial armor, without anyone accompanying him. He closed the door behind him with the specific quiet of a person who has made sure the latch is fully engaged. Lyra stood immediately. She gave the correct acknowledgement, looked at Alara once, a look that communicated everything it needed to in a single moment, and moved to the far end of the room, where she created the most credible version of being elsewhere that can be achieved by a person who is technically still present. Kalen looked at Alara. She did not stand. Protocol in this situation had no real guidance, because no situation precisely like this one appeared in any formal record she had access to, and partly because her legs had only recently finished their brief betrayal, and she was not yet entirely confident in their cooperation. He sat on the bench across from her, the bench facing hers, not beside her, the placement of two people who are about to have a real conversation, and are arranging themselves accordingly. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Tell me everything again," he said. "From the very beginning, leave nothing out, take the time you need." She told him everything. From the first observation 3 years ago of the specific quality of Mordecai's performance of warmth, the way Elder Rowan and Lord Adrian stopped their conversations when she passed, the wrong turn in the dim corridor, and the voices through the iron-banded door, and the fragments she had assembled from those voices, Lyra's chest, and her mother's note, and the account of the Keeper bloodline, what it was, what it had been designed to do, why it had been suppressed by people who understood very clearly what it threatened. The crescent mark, and what it meant, and what she had believed about it for her entire life, until 3 nights ago. She told him Seraphina's name, and the truth that had arrived through the bond, and that she had spoken without knowing she knew, and she told him she could not explain the mechanism of knowing only that it was true. He listened with complete attention. He asked nothing while she spoke. When she stopped, he asked 2 questions, precise and brief, that showed her he had received every word and had already begun to work with them. When she finished answering, the antechamber was quiet. "How long have you known what you are?" he said. 3 nights ago, she said. He absorbed this. "Your mother knew everything?" "She knew from the beginning. She chose to protect me from it for as long as she was able. She gave what she could not carry with her to Lyra, to pass on when the moment required it." He nodded. Not in agreement, in the way of someone placing a new piece of information into an existing structure and finding where it fits. "I have spent 2 years and 8 months trying to understand what happened to Seraphina." He said this plainly, in the register of something said many times in private, and spoken aloud for the first time, not with proof, with the shape of something I could not name, and could not set down. A pause. "What you told me on the dais. The specific thing. The thing you could not have known any other way." "I know," she said. "It was enough," he said. "It was finally enough." She held this for a moment, because it was not a simple thing. It was enough to move forward. It was enough to act on. It was not enough to give back the 2 years and 8 months, or to undo what those months had done to him. She understood from the way he said it that he understood this too, that enough was not the same as whole, and that the man sitting across from her knew the difference between those 2 words, in the specific way you can only know it through personal experience. "What happens now?" she asked. "Formal proceedings against Mordecai will begin within the next 3 days, he said. "The full council will convene. The evidence, including the transfer order, the revised protocol documentation, and your account, will be presented to the review board." He met her eyes. "You will not be transferred to the northern outpost." She nodded. "The bloodline suppression order," she said. "What is its legal standing?" "I have been reviewing that for some time," he said. Quietly, and without going through channels that Mordecai supervised. Something moved through his expression. "I believe you and I both already understand what the review is going to find." She looked at him across the small antechamber. "I am still an Omega servant," she said. "With no official rank and no formal standing in this household, I want to be completely clear that I understand this, and that I did not come to you today expecting any of that to change." She said it without apology, because it was simply true, and true things did not require apology. I came because there was a truth that needed to reach you, and I was the only person positioned to carry it. He was quiet for a moment. That is the most honest statement anyone has made to me in this room, in a significant amount of time, he said. I cannot be otherwise in your presence, she said. You know why. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite warmth in the ordinary sense, but that occupied the same general territory, the particular expression of someone who has received a piece of plain honesty, and found it more useful than almost anything else they have been given recently. I know, he said. He stood, straightened the edge of his ceremonial armor, and moved to the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. The East Garden, he said. Tomorrow morning, if you are willing. She looked at him. I will be there, Your Majesty. He left. She sat in the antechamber. Lyra reappeared from the far end of the room, at approximately the correct interval for a woman who had been deeply engaged in studying a blank stone wall. She sat beside Elara, and they looked at the closed door together. Well, Lyra said, very quietly. Yes, Elara said. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of things that are actually being resolved, which is considerably slower and less satisfying in the moment, and considerably more real in the outcome than the cleaner resolutions that stories sometimes offer. The formal proceedings against Elder Mordecai began 3 days after the coronation was completed at last, on the correct schedule, with the historical protocol restored to the form it had existed in before Mordecai's modifications. This restoration was quiet and contained no announcement. The court was informed that certain elements of the ceremonial structure had been updated to align with recently reviewed historical documentation. Those who were paying close attention understood what had been updated. Those who were not did not need to. The proceedings lasted 12 days. Elara gave her account to the formal review board in 2 sessions across those 12 days, each lasting several hours, in the plain and methodical way she had always told difficult truths, without adding anything that served her interests more than it served accuracy, without removing anything that complicated the picture, without shaping the material in any direction other than the direction of what actually happened. She told what she had observed, what she had overheard, what Lyra had explained to her, what her mother's note contained. She presented the note, which the review board handled with the careful deliberateness of people treating something as significant evidence rather than as paper from a woman who no longer lived. What emerged over the 12 days was not a story with a single author. Mordecai had not built what he had built alone. This was something Elara had suspected, and the proceedings confirmed it. The scale of what had been managed over the years, the suppression of bloodline records, the management of Seraphina's illness, the constructed version of the coronation protocol, the systematic control of what information reached the king, and from what direction, none of this was one person's work. It was a structure. A network of senior council members who had, over the course of 20 years, developed the habit of making decisions that should have belonged to the crown, and experiencing no consequence for making them. Mordecai had been the center of the network. The others occupied positions at various distances from the center. Lord Adrian had been one of them. This explained the stopped conversations. Elder Rowan had been another. This explained other things she had filed away over 3 years without being able to connect them. 2 council members resigned before the proceedings concluded. 3 were required to remain and answer questions through the formal process. The resignations were quiet and described in official language as personal decisions, but everyone in the household understood what they were. The truth about Seraphina's death took longer to emerge fully than the other elements of what Mordecai had arranged, because several of the people who had been involved in managing it were now engaged in remembering things as selectively as possible. But it emerged, not in a single dramatic disclosure, in the accumulated form of things that have been carefully hidden, which is to say in pieces, each piece making the next easier to find. Medical records that had been modified in ways that required a physician familiar with the original standard of care to recognize as modifications. An account from the attending physician that differed from the official record in specific and significant ways. Correspondence between Mordecai and another council member from the week before Seraphina died that described the situation in terms that eliminated any innocent interpretation. Kaelin was informed of each piece as it came in. Elara was not present for any of those conversations. She returned to her assigned work in the household, which was, by a process she did not fully trace, her original Third Wing assignment, rather than the Northern Outpost, with no formal explanation given, and no formal inquiry made on her part. The transfer order had ceased to be operative. This was sufficient. She and Lyra had developed an information system over those weeks. Lyra had better access to the household network than Alara did through her assigned section, and each evening, they compared what they had gathered and built the larger picture from its parts. The bloodline suppression order was reviewed by the kingdom's legal historian, a position that had not been formally occupied for 11 years and had to be reinstated specifically for this review. The legal historian was a woman named Iris who was approximately 70 years old and possessed, as Lyra reported through 3 separate sources, the specific quality of displeasure that comes from a professional discovering that something in her domain of expertise has been handled with significant dishonesty. She made her displeasure known to the full council in language that all 3 sources described differently, but with the same overall impression. The suppression order had been passed under procedurally invalid conditions. It required the Crown's formal approval under the original constitutional framework, and the Crown at the time of its passage had been, the historical evidence indicated deliberately, incapacitated for a period long enough to allow the Council to pass several decisions they needed him absent for. The Keeper bloodline suppression had been one of them. The order was not repealed, it was overturned. The legal distinction mattered. Repeal would have implied the decree was valid but no longer desired. Overturned meant it had been invalid from its first moment, and had therefore never functioned as law, regardless of the century and a half in which it had been treated as though it did. Alara heard this from Lyra on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the coronation morning. She sat with it in the small corner room for a while. She pressed her hand against the crescent on her collarbone, over the mark her mother had taught her to call nothing, and then she consciously removed her hand and placed it in her lap. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty. On the Wednesday morning she came through the East Wing corridor on her way to her morning assignment, and nearly walked into the King at the junction where the servants' passage met the formal administrative corridor, which had been relamped at full brightness following the review of the maintenance schedule. She could see him clearly, and he could see her, and both of them stopped, with the specific quality of surprise that comes from encountering something expected in an unexpected moment. He looked at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Your Majesty." He seemed for a moment as if he might say something else. Then he appeared to decide that it was better said somewhere other than a corridor, and he nodded once and continued on his way. She continued on hers. She thought about this for essentially the entire rest of that morning, which was not her most productive morning in terms of work output, but was arguably useful in other respects. The East Garden on the following Tuesday felt entirely different from the first time she had stood in it before dawn waiting for him to arrive. She was early again, without the cutting basket and the pretext of rosemary. She stood beside the stone path and watched the morning light come in from the east wall, the long horizontal lines crossing the herb borders in the way she had noticed many times before, and had never previously had the time to simply stand inside. She was not pretending to do anything. She was there, and she was waiting. And the garden knew what it was, and she knew what she was, and there was a directness to this that the first meeting had not had. He arrived at his usual time. He came around the corner of the stone path, and he did not pause when he saw her, a difference she noted. He came to the path beside her, and stood and looked at the herb border, and then at the morning light coming in from the east, and then at her. "You came back," he said. "You asked me to," she said. He nodded. The silence between them was different from the silence of the antechamber, different from the silence of the garden the first time. That silence had been the silence of formal territory, weighted with recent events, structured by defined roles, full of the things that had just happened and had not yet been fully processed. This silence was the silence of a garden at dawn, which is a different kind of territory. Open, simply present, neither formal nor the absence of form. "The legal determination regarding the bloodline order came through yesterday," he said. "I heard," she said. "Lyra told me." He looked at her. "How do you feel about it?" She considered this carefully, because he had asked it as a genuine question, and it warranted a genuine answer. "I am not certain yet," she said honestly. "I spent my entire life being told that the mark was nothing, and I should keep it covered. A lifetime of being told something is nothing does not reverse itself immediately when you discover it was something all along. It is going to take time." A pause. I think I am just beginning to understand what it means. The whole of it. He absorbed this without offering a reassurance she had not asked for. She appreciated this. She had never responded well to reassurances that were offered in advance of being needed. I owe you something, he said. Not the formal acknowledgement of an institutional debt. The simpler version. The version that acknowledged a person rather than a function. You do not, she said. I told you what I knew, because it was the truth, and it needed to reach you, not as a transaction. I know that, he said. It is not the same thing as saying I owe you nothing. She looked at him. He looked at her. The bond was present between them in the way it had been present since the coronation dais, not as a force or pressure or anything with dramatic visible edges, but as a quality in the air between them, a steadiness that was different from the ordinary steadiness of two people standing near each other. She had spent the past 3 weeks coming to understand it better, in the way that you understand something more clearly, when it is no longer theoretical, but simply present in your daily experience. The bond was not an imposition. It did not create something that was not already there. It made what was already there more clearly visible. The way good light makes a room more itself, rather than making it something different. She thought this was probably the better kind of truth, the kind that reveals rather than the kind that forces. There will be formal questions in the weeks ahead, she said. About my position in the household, about the bloodline status, about what changes. These will take time. They will, he said. I am not in a hurry, she said. She meant this. She had been patient for a very long time, and patience had its own kind of strength. Things that are built correctly take the time they need. He looked out at the herb border. The morning light had reached its full angle now, the long lines giving way to broader, warmer illumination that showed the garden as it actually was, rather than the version the dawn light made. She looked at the stone path. The bird in the outer grounds was finishing its routine. The garden is better with company in the mornings, he said. He said it simply, with the specific simplicity of someone offering something true without dressing it in more than it is. She thought about this, about all of it, about the 3 years that had led to this particular morning, in this particular garden, with the particular quality of light coming in from the east wall, and about the 5 days that had changed what those 3 years amounted to, and about everything on the other side of this moment that she did not yet know the shape of. I agree, she said. They stood side by side in the morning light, not speaking, not needing to. The building behind them began to fill with the sounds of the household starting its day, footsteps and voices, and the distant percussion of the kitchen beginning work. The herb border was still and damp and precisely itself. She was aware of the crescent mark on her collarbone in a way that was entirely new, not the habitual concealing awareness of something to be hidden, not the weight of a secret pressing inward, the awareness of something that simply was, present in her body, part of what she was, no longer requiring management or apology, or the downward pull of her collar. She did not pull her collar up. She stood in the morning light in the east garden with the mark visible and the bond settled and quiet in her chest, like something that had always been there, and had only recently stopped pretending it hadn't, and she looked at the stone path, and the herb border, and the light coming in from the east, and she stayed.